Donald S. McAlvany is president and owner of International Collectors Associates, a Denver-based precious metals brokerage and consultation firm. He is also the editor of the McAlvany Intelligence Advisor, a newsletter which analyzes global, monetary, economic, and geopolitical developments and the precious metals markets. For 10 years, Mr. McAlvany also edited the African Intelligence Digest. As chairman of the Council on Southern Africa, Mr. McAlvany leads an annual political and investment tour to South Africa. He is a consultant to various senators and congressmen on Southern Africa. Mr. McAlvany travels extensively, speaking at monetary conferences throughout the United States and 5 continents.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity of being with you here today. We're going to be talking about a very vital subject, I believe, to Americans, in fact, to people throughout the free world, and that is the survival of South and Southern Africa. We're going to look at the revolutionary onslaught that's being directed against South Africa, orchestrated by the Soviet Union. We'll be looking at the sanctions which are being leveled against South Africa by our own government. We'll be looking at things we should do to try to make sure that South Africa and their vast minerals treasure chest does not fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. And we'll try to see what Americans can do about these developments. Before we get into South Africa, I think we need to look at an overview of the world and see what exactly the Soviet strategy is for domination of the entire world, because their conquest of South Africa is only one part of a much larger picture. And so let's look at our map. This is a map of the world, and the places on the map that have the red are where the Soviets already are. Whether it's the Soviet Union or its various surrogate countries in Africa or in the Caribbean basin or in Southeast Asia or what have you. The Soviet Union has conquered some 40 countries since the end of World War II, and in fact believes that they can conquer most of the world between now and about 1995. The Soviets have a long-term strategy for the conquest of the world, and what they're doing in South and Southern Africa is only a part of that larger strategy. So let's take a few moments and let's look at that strategy. The first element of the Soviet grand strategy is a disarmament campaign directed against the Western powers in general and the United States in particular. I believe it was Dmitry Manuilsky said to the Lenin School for Political Warfare back in the 1930s, he said, "War to the hilt between communism and capitalism is inevitable. But today we're too weak to strike. Our day will come in 30 to 40 years, but first we must lull the capitalist nations to sleep with the greatest overtures of peace and disarmament known throughout history, and then when their guard is dropped, we shall smash them with our clenched fist." So over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen the Soviet Union pushing disarmament talks with the United States. We've seen the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1962, SALT I, SALT II. Now we have the START disarmament talks in Geneva. And in each of these instances, we've seen the Soviet Union violate almost all elements of these treaties while the United States has abided by them. And of course, during this period, the Soviet military machine has grown to where today, on both a conventional and a nuclear basis, it's the most powerful military machine in the history of the world. Retired Admiral Elmo Zumwalt has said that the Soviet Union actually passed the United States in armaments as early as 1972. So the first element of the Soviet grand strategy is a disarmament campaign. The second element is to sponsor national liberation movements. These would be movements like the Viet Cong in Vietnam, or the Sandinista National Liberation Front in Nicaragua, or the Irish Republican Army, or the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the African National Congress in South Africa, or SWAPO, Southwest Africa People's Organization in the Southwest Africa area. These national liberation fronts will be armed, backed, financed, trained by the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the world press will give them the appearance of credibility, the appearance of really being nationalist groups trying to liberate their countries. And in some instances, these national liberation groups have actually come to power and become the new government of that country, such as the Sandinistas, who are now the government of Nicaragua. The third major element in the Soviet grand strategy is propaganda wars, which they have launched against various target countries. We've seen propaganda wars against Chiang Kai-shek in China in the late 40s, against Batista in the 1950s. against the Shah of Iran and Somoza in the 1970s. And today, of course, we see a massive global propaganda war leveled against the South African government. The Soviets have a tremendous amount of influence in the world press. Excellent book written on the Soviets' ability to crank out disinformation a couple of years ago called The Spike by Arno Dvorgrov and Robert Moss talks about the Soviet penetration of the Western and in particular the U.S. media and how they can orchestrate a campaign, whether it's the anti-Vietnam War movement or the nuclear freeze movement or the anti-Shah or anti-Somoza movement, and now, of course, the anti-South Africa movement. The fourth element in the Soviet grand strategy is to pick off one pro-Western country at a time. We've seen some 40 countries fall into the communist orbit since the end of World War II. And as Alexander Solzhenitsyn has said, when will you in the West begin to realize that you can't keep losing one or two countries per year and have a Western world left? The fifth element of the Soviet grand strategy is to isolate the West from its mineral resources in the Middle East and in southern Africa. The so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, wherein in 1973 President Brezhnev in the Soviet Union said we will grab the oil resources of the Middle East and the strategic minerals of southern Africa, and then we will dictate the terms of surrender to the United States and to the West. The next element in the Soviet grand strategy is to gain control of Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf, neutralize Israel in something called Operation Pincer, which we'll look at in just a moment. Next is to dominate South and Southern Africa, which is our topic here today. Next is Soviet naval domination of the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans, including the Caribbean. Next is to neutralize NATO and the U.S. Western European allies. Next element of the Soviet grand strategy is orchestration of the international terror network, whereby there are some 110 international terrorist groups trained in some 66 terrorist training camps around the world, orchestrated by the Soviet Union, and certainly using certain countries like Libya, Syria, Iran, North Korea, Nicaragua, and Cuba as surrogates in this terror network. Next will be their conquest of Central America, revolution in Mexico, installation of pro-Soviet regimes from Colombia to the Rio Grande, the so-called Red Dawn scenario, whereby the Soviets believe they can topple like dominoes the various countries in Central America over the next 5 or 6 years. And the final element is nuclear blackmail. With the United States surrounded and tremendously overwhelmed by superior arms, the Soviets believe they can finally dictate surrender to the United States or be annihilated. Now, the Soviets have a long-term strategy. Whether they will ever succeed is only open to speculation. However, I think it's interesting to note that the Soviets are the great chess players of the world. They look far ahead to try to figure out what they're going to do, and the United States, unfortunately, does not have any long-term strategy. Okay, now with that as a bit of background, let's move along and look at an overview of Africa, of black Africa in particular. Now, black Africa is made up of some 12 million square miles. It has 55 countries and some 500 million people. You will never understand black Africa unless you understand it first within its tribal context. It is a tribal continent. There are several thousand different tribes with different languages, different cultures. These tribes fight and war amongst each other right up to today. And since 1970, there have been 5 million blacks killed by other blacks in tribal warfare. I'm always amazed at how the human rights advocates in the United States fail to notice the atrocities which are perpetrated by blacks against blacks throughout black Africa. For example, Idi Amin would kill 300,000 people in Uganda a few years ago. Emperor Bokassa, some 250,000 people in the Central African Republic. In Nigeria, 3.5 million Igbos were killed. And of course, their human rights were certainly violated, but very few people in the West seemed to care at all about that. You have throughout black Africa tribal, dictatorial, paternalistic structures. The concept of white Western democracy is not something that's well understood anywhere in black Africa. In fact, in black Africa since 1960, since the white colonial powers pulled out, you have had 75 bloody, forcible revolutions that have overthrown the existing government. 75. In Africa, the famous slogan is one man, one vote, one election. Now that I'm elected, I'll call myself president for life, like an Idi Amin, or emperor, like Emperor Bokassa, or I'll declare a one-party state, like Robert Mugabe has just done in communist Zimbabwe. So unfortunately, white Western democracy, which we are trying to push down the throat of Africa and South Africa, has had a very, very poor track record over the last 25 years in the Dark Continent. Black Africa today is an economic basket case. When the Western colonial powers pulled out of Africa in 1960, it was able to feed itself, it was able to export food, and today, because of black African socialism, you have millions and millions of people starving to death in Africa. In fact, it's estimated that you could have 10 to 20 million people starved to death in black Africa in the next 5 years. Black Africans respect power. And in this respect of power, a few years ago, if you had asked the average black African who was the most popular, greatest leader in Africa, most would have told you Idi Amin. And you would say, gee, he was a bloody butcher. He butchered 300,000 of his own people, and yet the black Africans would have told you he's strong, he's powerful, he's macho. And these kind of power perceptions in Africa are very, very important indeed. Because in Africa, in the African context, the Soviet Union is seen as being very strong, very macho, whereas the United States is seen as being very weak indeed. Now, you come into this black African context with the Soviet African strategy. And the Soviet African strategy is a very, very well thought out strategy, actually strategized in the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. And they have a threefold strategy, a strategy for North Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. Now, in order to understand the strategy for North Africa, let's look at a map and look at what the Soviets call Operation Pincer. Operation Pincer is a long-term surrounding of the Persian Gulf oil fields with one pincer coming down through Libya, Sudan, Ethiopia, the other pincer coming down through Afghanistan, Iran, and they believe one day on into the Persian Gulf and into Saudi Arabia. This pincer movement actually began about 1969 when the Soviet Union collaborated with Colonel Gaddafi to help him overthrow King Idris in Libya. Actually, you had Soviet vessels sitting right outside in the harbor of Tripoli as the Soviets helped place Gaddafi in power. The Soviets have since told Colonel Gaddafi that they will help him to become an emperor of all of North Africa. He seems to like this idea. The Soviets have moved a massive amount of Soviet arms into Libya. In fact, there are some 2,800 tanks in Libya today, Soviet tanks. That's twice as many tanks as the country of France has. There are some 565 Soviet MiG jets in Libya today, and that would be larger than the Air Force of France, Germany, or England. They are using this as a giant arms depot for further actions in North Africa and in the Middle East. And of course, some of these arms are now being shipped out of Libya directly to the terrorist organizations in southern Africa. The plan is for Libya to come down and finally take over the Sudan. Ethiopia was conquered by the Soviets some 11 years ago, and today is a total Marxist dictatorship kept in power by the Soviet Union. There is a famine in Ethiopia today, but it's a man-made famine whereby the pro-Soviet government of Ethiopia is systematically starving millions of blacks to death, people who oppose that Marxist regime, much as Mr. Khrushchev and Stalin starved millions of people to death in the Ukraine back in the 1930s. You can see the pressure from this pincer, this left-hand side of the pincer, that's coming down and putting pressure on Egypt, and the idea is to either push Egypt back into the Soviet camp from whence Sadat brought it several years ago, or in fact overthrow Mubarak and establish a pro-Soviet regime. The right-hand side of the pincer comes down through Afghanistan, where the Soviets moved in with their occupation forces in late '79 and early 1980. Today there are 120,000 Soviet troops in Afghanistan. In the last 5 years, the Soviets have butchered 1.5 million men, women, and children. Now, you would suppose that there would be a tremendous outcry of outrage from the Western powers because of these horrible atrocities. You would expect to see demonstrations in front of the Soviet embassy in Washington, but not so. Most of those people are too busy demonstrating in front of the South African embassy in Washington. So the Soviets have a grand strategy for North Africa. Let's move along now and look at the Soviet grand strategy for Central Africa. In Central Africa, the Soviets would like to take over the country of Zaire. Zaire is a very mineral-rich country which has a tremendous amount of the world's copper, diamonds, cobalt, and so forth. If the Soviet Union could conquer Zaire, they can basically cut the continent of Africa in half and have its solid band of red countries from the South Atlantic all the way to the South Indian Ocean. The Soviet Union made a tremendous attempt to take Zaire in 1977 and 78. And interestingly, the U.S., which had been aiding President Mobutu up until that time, the United States government cut aid to President Mobutu, our ally, even as liberation forces and Cubans were moving on that country. When asked why, the Carter administration said, "While we are working on rapprochement with Cuba, and we wouldn't want to interfere in those negotiations." And at that time, Morocco and France and several European powers, Egypt, came in and saved the day for Zaire. The Soviets will make another attempt in the next few years to take Zaire. If they take Zaire, the whole balance of power in southern Africa will change, and of course South Africa will be totally isolated. Okay, let's move on down and look at the Soviet strategy in southern Africa now. And there are three key countries in southern Africa that we should look at. First is Mozambique. Mozambique was a Portuguese colony, and in 1975, the Portuguese pulled out of Mozambique and went home to fight their own political battles at home. And they left a terrorist organization there, which unfortunately went in quickly into the power vacuum, called Frelimo. 8,000 Soviet-backed terrorists took over a country of some 8 million people, and today it is a surrogate of the Soviet Union. They have long-term peace and military agreements with the Soviet Union. You have 20,000 Soviet occupation forces, which are effectively keeping that communist government in power. You have concentration camps in Mozambique with 300,000 blacks, and where some 75,000 blacks have died in the last 5 or 6 years. Some 15,000 black children have been shipped to slave labor camps to do slave labor in Cuba and in East Germany. And unfortunately, all of these developments have not kept the Reagan administration in the last 2 years from pumping some $60 million in U.S. aid into the communist government of Mozambique. And as recently as the spring of 1986, the Reagan administration proposed another $27 million of aid to go to communist Mozambique. There is an anti-communist resistance movement in Mozambique called Renamo, and with a little aid from the Western powers, Renamo could actually take over that country. Okay, let's move over to the other side of the continent and look at Angola. Angola was also a Portuguese colony. When Angola saw the Portuguese leave their country in 1975, you had three guerrilla organizations that began to vie for control of that country. One was the MPLA, which operates out of northwestern Angola and was backed by the Soviets and Cubans. The other was FLNA, which operates out of northeastern Angola, and it was supported by the US CIA. And UNITA, which operates out of southeastern Angola and was supported by a number of the Western powers. The Soviets airlifted some 15,000 Cuban troops into Angola, and the Civil War swung in 1976 in favor of the communists. And then the United States government and other Western powers asked South Africa to come into Angola and to try to turn things around. And so South Africa sent some 2,000 troops into Angola. They hooked up with Dr. Jonas Savimbi's UNITA forces in southern Angola, and they actually marched through and over the Cuban and Russian troops. They marched all the way to Luanda and were in the process of pushing the communists out into the Atlantic Ocean when suddenly the United States Senate passed the Clark Amendment, and the Clark Amendment cut off all U.S. aid to the pro-Western forces in Angola. Then our State Department came along, and our State Department said, we don't think that the South Africans have any business being there, although we had invited them in. And then the United Nations declared South Africa to be an aggressor nation. And so, feeling highly betrayed, the South Africans pulled out of Angola. And as they pulled out of Angola, they effectively left a power vacuum, and the Soviets and the Cubans took over most of the country. However, not all of the country did they take over. The southeastern one-third, as we can see on this map, of Angola is actually still controlled by the pro-Western forces of Dr. Jonas Savimbi. His army has about 65,000 people in it. If there were free one-man, one-vote elections, which the State Department is, of course, always pushing for South Africa, but not for communist Angola, he would win by about a 95% vote. You have opposed to Dr. Savimbi some 65,000 Soviet bloc troops made up of about 45,000 Cubans and 20,000, a montage of some 20,000 Russians, East Germans, North Koreans, North Vietnamese, PLO, Libyans, etc., etc. There's another 65,000 Angolan communist troops, part of the MPLA army. Now, the Soviets have shipped into Angola some 1,500 Soviet tanks, some 400 to 500 high-performance MiG jets, and they would like to try to take Dr. Savimbi out. As a matter of fact, There was a major attack on Savimbi's forces in the summer of 1985, and another one is being prepared in mid-1986. If the Soviets can take out Savimbi, this would be very, very serious indeed. If you'll look at a map of southern Africa, you'll see that in very quick succession, you would have a domino of countries falling to the total control of the Soviet Union, including Zambia, Zaire, Botswana, Southwest Africa, and within 18 months of the fall of Savimbi, you would in fact see Soviet tanks on the South African border. So a very, very important battle is shaping up in southern Africa. Now, I think it's noteworthy that the communist government is kept in power by financing from Western governments, but in particularly from the United States government and certain U.S. corporations. There's a large oil refinery called the Cabinda Province Oil Refinery up in northeastern Angola, and the Cabinda Province Oil Refinery cranks some $2 billion a year into the Angolan economy, and that's the exact price tag for keeping the 65,000 Russians, Cubans, and other communist bloc powers in that country. And in spite of the fact that Chevron Oil and Gulf Oil, which run that Cabinda oil refinery, have said, well, you know, gee, someone else would come in and run it if we didn't, they are supporting the communists as they stay in power there. Not only that, but the Reagan administration in the last 3 years, through the Export-Import Bank and through the auspices of the Reagan State Department under Secretary of State George Shultz and Undersecretary of State for African Affairs Chester Crocker, they have pumped some $200 million into the communist government of Angola. So it's very, very strange how we seem to help our enemies and kick our friends in southern Africa. Now let's move on to South Africa and take a look at why the Soviet Union wants South Africa so badly. Let's look at why President Brezhnev said in 1973 in his Brezhnev Doctrine, we must grab the mineral resources from the Middle East and the strategic minerals from South Africa, and then we will dictate the terms of surrender to the United States and the West. Okay, South Africa is very strategically located, and in South Africa you have the greatest minerals treasure chest that the entire Western world could have. 90% of the strategic minerals of the entire world, 90%, are controlled by South Africa and the Soviet Union. If those minerals would fall to the Soviet Union, we would no longer be able to build jet aircraft, bridges, automobiles, steel. The United States would be forced back to the horse and buggy days, as would Western Europe, Japan, and most of the Western powers. We see in South Africa such minerals as manganese, 78% of global reserves, 93% of free world reserves. Chrome, 81% of global reserves. Platinum, 84% of global reserves, 92% of free world reserves. Platinum is an irreplaceable metal. Platinum is used in probably 20% of the various items which are manufactured in the United States. There is no place we can go for platinum, for any quantities of platinum, except to South Africa or the Soviet Union. In fact, it is the threat to these platinum supplies over the last several months that has pushed platinum in the last 18 months from $237 an ounce up to $675 an ounce, a rise of $185, largely because of fears of the source of supply, that it could be in jeopardy. Gold, 51% of global reserves come from South Africa, 66% of free world reserves. Vanadium, 49% of global reserves. Fluorspar, some 35% of global reserves, etc., etc. South Africa is absolutely essential to the survival of the United States, to our military strength, to our industrial strength, and the Soviets know it, and they want it, and they are working very rapidly to try to take South Africa. In addition to the tremendous mineral resources and riches of South Africa, you have coming around South Africa the Cape shipping lanes. Around the Cape of Good Hope are super tankers sailing every day. They're too large to go through the Suez Canal, and they are laden with oil destined for Western Europe or the United States. Some 90% of Western Europe's and some 40% of the United States' oil comes around those the Cape shipping lanes and super tankers, and if the Soviet Union were to dominate South Africa, they could stop those oil shipments, and again, as we were told by President Brezhnev, they could dictate the terms of surrender to the United States and to the West. Now, South Africa, like the rest of black Africa, has a very, very complex racial breakdown. South Africa has some 10 or 11 different tribes. They have different languages, they have different cultures, they fight and they war amongst each other. When they were migrating south some 300 years ago, many of these tribes were actually fighting and killing each other off. The Zulus, which are the largest of these tribes, they number about 6 million. When they migrated south about 300 years ago, about the time that the whites were landing at Cape Town and about the time that Americans were landing in Jamestown, we saw the Zulus wipe out around 150 separate tribes. They're the largest of these tribes. They're the most warlike of the tribes. They have a president, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who happens to be very anti-communist, very pro-Western, and the Zulus will figure very prominently in the future multiracial government in South Africa. A second tribe is the whites, and they're considered a white tribe, and there's about 4.5 million whites in South Africa. About two-thirds of those are Afrikaners of Dutch background, and about 1/3 are Anglicaners of English background. Then you have the coloreds, or mulattoes as we would call them. The coloreds would be the same as our blacks in the United States, and there's 2.5 million of them, and they don't have a tribal culture or background. They have a culture that is almost identical to that of the whites. You have the Sutus, 1.8 million. You have the Xhosas, which live in Transkei, about 1.8 million. The Kwakwas, about 1.7 million. The Swanans in Bophuthatswana, which are about 1.4 million. The Xhosas, which live in Ciskei, about 1.3 million. Asians, which are really Indians, which are about 1 million. And so you have a situation where you have all of these various different tribes, different languages, different cultures. In the South African context, you can integrate blacks and whites more easily than you can integrate blacks and blacks. You have never been able to mix the various black tribes. Some of the mining companies have tried to do this, and it has resulted in fighting, and it has resulted in instability and riots in some of the mines over the years. So it's very, very difficult to mix the various blacks. Now, you have a situation where these blacks, when they migrated south several hundred years ago, they settled in what are called homelands. Now, the homeland policy is very controversial, but these homelands are not reservations like we pushed our Indians onto. These homelands are where the blacks voluntarily settled some years back. And of course, this would be where the Zulus live, KwaZulu, and in Transkei and Ciskei is where you have the Xhosas live. In Bophuthatswana, you have the Swanas live, and in Venda, you have the Vendas live, and so forth. Now, 4 of these homelands have actually become independent countries. They have a stronger economy and a greater population in probably about 45 countries in the United Nations, but none of the countries in the United Nations, including the United States and the Western powers, will recognize these independent homeland republics because they were given birth by the hated apartheid regime, South Africa. Now, in South Africa, you have about 60% of your blacks, 55 to 60%, live in the tribal context. They live out in the countryside. They live as subsistence farmers. They live in their kraals. They have their village headmen and paramount chiefs and so forth. And they live on a tribal basis much as they would have lived 500 or 1,000 years ago. And they're very content, and they really don't understand the concepts of white Western democracy. They don't understand the concepts of one man, one vote. These things are pretty foreign to them. Now you have around 45 to 50% of the blacks in South Africa live in and around the major cities like Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, Durban, East London, Port Elizabeth, and so forth. They work in the white mines, they work in the white factories. They have a standard of living and wages which are approximately 5 times higher than blacks throughout black Africa, and as a result, you have a tremendous influx of blacks into that country each year. In fact, about 500,000 blacks a year try to come into that country to live because the standard of living and wages are so high in South Africa versus in the countries to the north. So South Africa finds itself in the unique position they have to build fences or walls to keep blacks out. The Soviet Union, of course, builds walls to keep its people in. Now, it's not perfect in South Africa. Yes, there has been discrimination. What, for example, is apartheid? Apartheid simply means separate development, and it was adopted as an official policy of the South African government in 1948 in order to take into account the different cultures of the various black tribal groups. Unfortunately, out of apartheid, or separate development, grew the concept of petty apartheid, and much of the kind of discrimination which we were all familiar with in the United States when we were very highly segregated in this country only around 30 years or so ago. Now, I think the important thing to note is that much of this discrimination and most of apartheid has now been dismantled. You've had a situation in the last few years where influx control, one of the sore spots for blacks, has been abolished. The past laws are gone. Mixed marriage laws have been repealed. Property rights have been granted to blacks. All public accommodations have now been integrated. You go to South Africa today and you will find blacks in the same hotels that whites are. They're eating in the same restaurants. They're attending the same athletic events. Equal pay for equal work is becoming a reality. South African citizenship rights are now in the process of being granted to blacks. You now have a three-chamber government in South Africa. One chamber for whites, one chamber for coloreds, and one chamber for the Indians. There will soon, within the next year or so, be a fourth chamber, and that will take into account the blacks. It's more complicated because the blacks are broken down into different tribes and so forth. Now, it's very significant that Americans understand that much of apartheid has already been abolished, that there is rapid racial reform taking place. More racial reform in the last 3 to 5 years in South Africa than in the last 50 years in the United States, and yet you would never know this by listening to the world press. You would swear up and down that the blacks are totally oppressed. You would swear up and down that they live in squalor. And I take groups to South Africa each year. We go down into Soweto and the various black townships. And no, they're not perfect. No, I wouldn't particularly want to live there, but I will tell you that the blacks in many of these townships live much better than the blacks in some of the poorer areas of the United States. So it's not perfect, but it's certainly changing very rapidly, and unfortunately the Western powers and the Western press give the South Africans absolutely no credit for the positive changes which are taking place. Okay, now let's look at some of the various forces that are arrayed against South Africa, because the problem for South Africa is that it doesn't matter how much racial reform takes place in South Africa, it will never satisfy the Western powers until a black Marxist government is in power in Pretoria, just as racial reform took place in Zimbabwe. In fact, let me back up and give you the story of Zimbabwe, because I think it's a good example of exactly the kind of thing that South Africa can expect. Zimbabwe had a multiracial government. It was made up of blacks and whites. However, the whites did dominate the country. It was one of the most prosperous countries in South Africa, or in Southern Africa. In 1976, however, we began to get a tremendous uproar in the Western press. The race war was coming to Southern Africa. Race war was coming to Southern Africa. I happened to be down in Southern Africa at the time, and it was simply not true. That was climaxed in September of 1976 by Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State under Gerald Ford at the time. He jumped on an airplane and he flew down to Southern Africa, but he went first to Pretoria. And of course, the South African government had been giving support to the Rhodesian government in their civil war or in their guerrilla war with the communists who were operating out of Zambia and out of Mozambique. And Henry Kissinger went in and saw then Prime Minister John Foster, and he said, look, we know you've been supporting South Africa, and we want you to stop. And if you don't stop, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that your Iranian oil is cut off. We're going to make sure that world sanctions are placed against you. And furthermore, we're going to make sure that the price of oil, of gold, which makes up 40% of the foreign exchange and the economy of South Africa, that the price of gold is pushed down to some $50 an ounce. It was trading right around 100 at that time, and the South African economy was very, very much on its back. Well, the South African government thought about that very briefly, and then they told Ian Smith, you must go to black rule, we have no choice. Kissinger then flew up to Rhodesia, and he talked with Ian Smith, and some 24 hours later, Ian Smith came out and said, my head is on a platter, what can I do? We will go to black rule. A number of agreements were made, including that they would move towards a transition government. As they moved towards a transition government, wrote a new constitution, the United States would lift the sanctions against Rhodesia. We would make sure that the guerrilla war stopped. We would push aid into Rhodesia, and we would aid them as they went in their transition to a black government. Ian Smith and the blacks and whites of Rhodesia, they agreed to abided by every single promise, and unfortunately, the United States broke every single one of its promises. Finally, a black government under Bishop Abel Muzorewa was elected to power in 1979. Still, the United States government, violating the Kissinger Accords, refused to recognize that government. We refused to lift the sanctions against that government. And finally, the United States State Department and the British Foreign Office forced new elections on Rhodesia. now called Zimbabwe, in 1980 and helped place a communist by the name of Robert Mugabe, part of the Patriotic Front, in power. Then and only then did the United States government lift the sanctions and to begin to pump aid into Zimbabwe, only when they had not a black government, because for 1 year they had a black pro-Western government and we wouldn't recognize it, only when they had a black communist government. And since 1981, the Reagan administration has actually pumped some $375 million into communist Zimbabwe. Okay, let's now look then at South Africa, because the unfortunate situation in South Africa is no matter how much the change takes place and how positive the change is, it seems that their friends in the West will not recognize those changes. Okay, let's look at the forces that are now arrayed against South Africa. First, you have Soviet bloc troops beginning to surround South Africa. Some 65,000 Soviet bloc troops in Angola, some 8,000 Soviet bloc troops in Zimbabwe, in communist Zimbabwe, and some 20,000 Soviet bloc troops in Mozambique. The general strategy is to put external pressure with these Soviet troops and Soviet arms, and unfortunately today the most powerful military force in southern Africa is no longer South Africa, even though they do have a formidable military. It is the Soviet Union. They're moving massive amounts of weapons into the region. A lot of them are being transshipped from Libya. A lot of the terrorist forces in that area are being trained by Libyans, PLO, and so forth. So external pressure exerted by the Soviet military forces is part of the strategy. The rest of the strategy is internal revolution. And for that, they're using a number of national liberation groups, as we discussed earlier in this seminar. First is the African National Congress. Founded in 1912, taken over by the South African Communist Party in 1948, the African National Congress is a complete surrogate of the Soviet Union. It is armed, trained, and financed by the Soviet Union. Many of its leaders received their training in the Soviet Union, in Libya, in Syria, in Iran, and so forth. Excellent study done on this by Senator Jeremiah Denton. His subcommittee, his Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Security and Terrorism, in 1982, did a lengthy study. Anyone can write to Senator Denton's office and get a copy of this study. It documents in tremendous detail the Soviet domination of the African National Congress. The Central Intelligence Agency in the summer of 1986 has also come out with a report. It is classified at this point on the same subject. Now, it's very important that we understand the Soviet control of the ANC, because right now the United States State Department is trying to push the African National Congress as the legitimate government of South Africa, and is trying to push South Africa to negotiate a new government dispensation with the African National Congress, just as we pushed Ian Smith to negotiate, and finally Bishop Muzorewa to negotiate a new government with the Communist Patriotic Front. You also have the Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO, which is the National Liberation Group in Namibia. You have the South African Communist Party, which has total allegiance to the Soviet Union. It is run by Joe Slavo, who is a KGB in the Soviet, or is a colonel in the Soviet KGB, and is a white man, I might add. It totally dominates the South African National Congress. You have the Pan-African Congress, another liberation group, which is also receives terrorist training in Libya and Iran and so forth, and the United Democratic Front, which is the internal wing of the African National Congress. Also among the forces arrayed against South Africa is the United Nations, which has spawned dozens and dozens of anti-apartheid groups in recent years and would love to see the ANC installed as the new government of South Africa. The U.S. State Department and the British Foreign Office, which are very pro-African National Congress. The global media, including the South Africa media, is very, very much lined up against South Africa. Now, the strange thing is that you can't read much of anything in the world press that is accurate about South Africa. I've traveled to South Africa some 25 times in the last 10 years, and I will tell you that some 95% of what you read in the U.S. and the world press is false about South Africa. Remember, the third element of the Soviet grand strategy, propaganda wars against the target countries, just as they did to Chiang Kai-shek and to Batista and to Somoza and to the Shah of Iran, they're doing to South Africa. None of the positive racial progress or reform is being shown, only the bad part. None of the atrocities being perpetrated by the communist revolutionaries against the blacks, primarily, are being showed by the world press. Unfortunately, the South African press is just about as distorted and as far to the left and anti-South Africa as the world press is. It supports the ANC. Also arrayed against South Africa is the World Council of Churches and various affiliated church organizations. You also have some 200 anti-apartheid groups. And unfortunately, you also have the U.S. liberal Eastern establishment and the Socialist International lined up against South Africa. Now, just a word about the sanctions which the United States is about to push through against South Africa and, in fact, most of the Western world. These sanctions are absolute insanity. Next time someone tells you that sanctions against South Africa are good, you look them in the eye and you tell them that they are bloody racists. And you say, well, how could that be? Well, let's just go back to the 1960s when we had our civil rights movement in the United States and people were demonstrating for greater rights for the blacks in America. If you had stood up and said, I have a program that will put millions of blacks out of work, it would not have been appreciated. It would have been looked at as bloody racism, and yet that's exactly what the liberals and the human rights advocates and the anti-apartheid people throughout this country, and they include people in our State Department, in our media, and in the U.S. Congress, that's exactly what they're trying to do. Disinvestment will put about 1.5 million South African blacks and a couple of million blacks from external countries around South Africa out of work. You are talking about then 12 to 15 million people that will be pushed into poverty if you count their dependents. And of course, that's tremendous human suffering. And this is supposed to be the way we're going to help the blacks in South and Southern Africa. It is total, sheer lunacy. You don't help people by hurting them and put them out of work. Let's really get down to the bottom line. What is the real issue in South Africa today? The real issue, as this picture will show, is revolution. The Soviet Union is pushing and backing revolution in South Africa. They believe that through bloody overthrow of the South African government that they can establish a pro-Soviet regime in South Africa. You will see this picture throughout South Africa today, throughout the various black townships, the Soviet flag very openly flying. This is at a large funeral demonstration that's taking place. You will find, usually in order of priority, behind the Soviet flag, you will find flying the flag of the African National Congress, well, first the South African Communist Party, then the African National Congress, and then the United Democratic Front. You have in the townships throughout South Africa today, you have people's committees that are meeting, people's courts. Some of the black townships in South Africa today are totally dominated by these people's committees, by these communist committees operating under the control and direction of the South African Communist Party and of the African National Congress. The situation is very bloody in a number of the townships. And in fact, I'd like to read to you very quickly a letter from a woman in one of the black townships that describes what the situation has been like in recent months. Here's what she had to say. The situation in our black township has become critical, where black civic leaders are brutally murdered. The same communist tactics is used against village leaders in South Vietnam and in El Salvador today. Black businessmen have their business premises burned to the ground, their delivery vehicles destroyed, their families terrorized in the most horrendous manner. Most of the black civic leaders, mayors, and town councilors in the country have resigned. I did read only 3 or 4 town councilors are still operable. A pamphlet was sent out a month ago with a cartoon of a sizzling chicken and a caption, Kentucky Fried Chicken, with the name of the town councilor neatly printed on the body of the steaming bird. Naturally, the desired effects were achieved and resignations poured in. The memory of poor town councilor Kenny, who was chopped to bits, roasted, and partially eaten, was still horrifically clear in their minds. Here's a picture of town councilor Kenny's son. The revolutionaries took he and his 5 sons out and they burned them to death and they tortured them in the most incredible fashion simply because they would not join in with the revolution. This is the story throughout South Africa today in the black townships. You hear that thousands of people have been killed, but the press gives the impression they're being killed by the government, and that is simply not true. These people are being butchered by the revolutionaries. Town councilors, mayors, businessmen, black policemen are being butchered in order to try to intimidate the black population into going along with the revolution. This was one of the poor innocent victims. The other picture here is Maki Skaskona. She was a black girl who attended a large funeral rally. She was accused of being a government informer, thrown to the ground. She was stoned. She was burned to death. A few feet away, a Dutch news team captured this on film, horrible pictures.
Sell out, Let him bang.
On the same day, at another funeral rally at a nearby township, Alan Bossack, president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, an organization which supports the revolution in South Africa, was haranguing for the overthrow of the South African government, and positioned behind him was a giant Soviet flag.
And I would like to know why those church leaders who are so quick to condemn us when we ask to pray for the removal of unjust rule and say that we want violence, why don't they rise up and tell the state president who cannot use the name of Jesus to justify it?
The New York Times had a news team there. They photographed that. However, when the picture was shown in the New York Times, they cropped out the picture of the Soviet flag. Guess they felt the American people didn't need to see that particular aspect. Now, they have a particularly terrible way in which they are trying to intimidate the black moderates. This particular technique is called the necklace treatment. Some 600 blacks have died by the necklace treatment, and this picture shows what the necklace treatment looks like, and I would like to describe the necklace treatment to you. First, the terrified victim is captured by his or her executioners. These are black moderates. Frequently, his hands are hacked off as a deterrent to resistance. Barbed wire is otherwise used to tie the helpless victim's wrists together. The tire, an automobile tire, is then placed over the shoulders and filled with petrol or diesel. The latter has been found to stick to the skin when it burns. The fuel is ignited with a match. Exhibiting boxes of matches is one of the ways that the comrades create respect or fear in the townships. The victim is usually forced to light his own necklace. The fuel ignites the tire, which rapidly attains a temperature of 400 to 500 degrees centigrade. As the tire burns, great clouds of black smoke spiral upward. Various short-chain hydrocarbon-type fumes are released, which reach a temperature of 300 degrees centigrade. They are inhaled and destroy the lining of the throat and lungs. The rubber melts and the molten rubber runs down the neck and torso, burning as it goes deeper and deeper into the flesh and tissue. The tire cannot be removed by others, like a family at this point. Neither can the fire be doused with water. The victim is now a living corpse. The victims may take up to 20 minutes to die, and while he endures this agony, the comrades stand by laughing and ridiculing him. Often members of his family are encouraged to attempt to save him. The comrades know that this cannot be done. The molten rubber is similar to boiling tar and cannot be separated from the scorched flesh. Some 600 men and women and children, human souls such as you, have been destroyed by the communist revolutionaries in order to intimidate the thousands and millions of other blacks around them into going along with the revolution. And yet the United States and the world press refuses to report these atrocities because it would make the ANC and the communists look bad. What about Winnie Mandela? She's the darling of the United States State Department and the U.S. press. What about Winnie Mandela, the wife of the jailed communist revolutionary Nelson Mandela? Here's what she had to say recently on an interview with Moscow's TASS International News Service. This was broadcast on February 13th, 1986 through Radio Zimbabwe. Here's what Winnie Mandela said. I have waited for long years personally to send my militant salute to the land of the Soviets, to thank it for its fraternal solidarity. In Soviet Russia, genuine power of the people has been transformed from dreams into reality. The land of the Soviets is the genuine friend and ally of all oppressed peoples fighting against the dark forces of world reaction. I believe she means the United States. Our struggle for freedom is indissolubly linked with the worldwide peace movement for which your great country, meaning the Soviet Union, is a standard bearer. The same Winnie Mandela said and was quoted by Reuters in a Soweto speech on the 13th of April, 1986. She said, "We have reached a very serious stage in our struggle. The time for speeches has come to an end. 1986 is going to see the liberation of the oppressed black masses of this country. Together, hand in hand, with our sticks of matches, with our necklaces," and this is what she means by necklaces, "with our necklaces we shall liberate this country." This is liberation, communist style, ANC style in South Africa. What of Nelson Mandela himself, the man who was called by Time magazine as the great potential leader for South Africa? Our State Department believes he should be released and they should negotiate, and conceivably he should become the next prime minister of a black liberated South Africa. Well, Nelson Mandela joined the African National Congress in 1944, was jailed for terrorism in 1962. It seems that he and his fellow ANC saboteurs were caught red-handed with 48,000 Soviet-made anti-personnel mines, 210,000 hand grenades, and documents showing proof of involvement of Moscow, Algeria, China, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany in financing and backing a communist revolution in South Africa. During his trial, a 62-page document in his handwriting entitled "How to Be a Good Communist" was offered as evidence. Here's what the man who would be king said. Under communist rule, South Africa will become a land of milk and honey. In our country, the struggle of the oppressed masses is led by the South African Communist Party, of which he was a leader at that time, and is inspired by its policy. We Communist Party members are the most advanced revolutionaries in modern history and are the contemporary fighting and driving force in changing society in the world. Later on, in another document, he went on to say, the people of South Africa, led by the South African Communist Party, will destroy capitalist society and build in its place socialism. The transition from capitalism to socialism and the liberation of the working class cannot be effected by slow changes or by reforms, as reactionaries and liberals often advise. You see, they're against the reform movement that's taking place in South Africa, but by revolution. One must therefore be a revolutionary and not a reformist. That's Nelson Mandela, the man the United States State Department and the liberals of America would like to see be the next Prime Minister of South Africa. The Shah of Iran wrote in his memoirs called The Shah's Story in 1980, shortly before he died. He wrote the pattern of revolution that had swept his own country and that later swept Nicaragua. And I think it's significant to see 8 points as we draw this meeting to a close. 8 points which are a pattern of revolution that has been used all over the world and is being used in South Africa today. The first point in this pattern of revolution that the Shah described was that the mass media is used to soften up world opinions and governments as to how evil and repressive the target regime is. Second, leftist religious leaders, because of their credibility, following, and general naivety, are drawn into the revolution to help lead the masses against the government. This would include leftist leaders such as Bishop Tutu, who was pro-Marxist, pro-Soviet, pro-African National Congress. Just last year he remarked, "I find what I have seen of capitalism and the free market system quite morally repulsive. If the Russians were come to South Africa today, then most blacks would reject communism. Who would reject communism as atheistic and materialistic would welcome them as saviors. Anything would be better than apartheid." Okay, so black religious leaders have gotten involved in the revolution. Unfortunately, you saw this in Nicaragua, you saw this in Iran, and now you see it in South Africa. Third, the more the target government liberalizes conditions in its country, the more the revolutionaries use those changes as a sign of weakness and escalate their demands. And that's, of course, we have seen in Nicaragua, in Iran, and we're seeing in South Africa today. Fourth, the revolutionaries use bereavement tactics to create new mass demonstrations and violence at funerals, just as these pictures will show of the Soviet flag flying in the mass funeral demonstrations. At funerals, each time a revolutionary or innocent victim is killed. Fifth, the gullible youth are drawn in, emotionally incited to violence, imbued with the feeling of power, and sent out in violent gangs to attack moderate anti-revolutionary targets, like this poor soul who received the necklace treatment. Sixth, the trained revolutionaries begin to pull out pre-positioned arms and explosives and attack police stations, government installations, power stations, murder moderate leaders, and move the country to the brink of chaos. In fact, we saw this in the spring of 1986. On May Day of 1986, we saw 1.5 million blacks take to the street, and in fact, the idea was on the 16th of June to create a revolution and to try to bring down the government. And so on the 12th of June, the South African government was forced to institute a state of national emergency. Seventh, the revolutionaries incite strike boycotts, strikes, and strike violence, escalating these to a general strike to paralyze the country. And eighth, the U.S. government appears on the scene, usually the State Department, to withdraw all of its support from the beleaguered ally, to ease out the faltering regime, that is, to intimidate it into capitulation, and to usher in the revolutionary government, usually putting the best face possible on it, calling it a national democratic government. This was the Shah of Iran describing the revolutionary pattern in his own country. We've seen it in Iran, we've seen it in Nicaragua, we are seeing it today in South Africa, and of course we have seen it recently in the country of the Philippines. What should Americans do about these developments in South and Southern Africa? This is the most critical and strategic national security issue the United States will face in the decade of the 1980s. If we lose South Africa to the Soviet Union, within 5 years, the United States and our very survival will be in jeopardy. Americans, number one, need to look at this issue and get mad. Mad at the fact that we are willing to support our enemies throughout Southern Africa with aid, and at the same time to kick our friends black and white. Americans need to get informed on this issue before they can really do anything about it. I believe it's been said that action without knowledge leads to confusion and chaos, and you've got to get informed. It's very difficult simply listening to the television and reading your local newspapers to understand exactly what is going on. We need to understand as a people that this is not a black and white conflict in Southern Africa, that it's black and white versus red. It's the Soviet Union trying to take over another strategic part of the world. We need to understand that South Africa is not the ultimate target, that they are simply a stepping stone, part of the Soviets' grand strategy worked out 40 or 50 years ago to try to take over the entire world, but the ultimate target is the United States of America. South Africa is simply a stepping stone. There are a number of ways you can get informed. I would like to suggest that you write for a newsletter, 2 newsletters, which we have done in recent months. One is entitled Revolution and Betrayal, the Accelerating Onslaught Against South Africa. The other is The Accelerating Revolution in South Africa. We will be happy to send these to you if you will simply call us at 800-525-9556. There are other sources of information. There are other books available. And the back of one of these reports is a whole list of books and studies which you can get, ranging from the Jeremiah Denton subcommittee reports and so forth. There is one organization in the United States that is doing a tremendous amount to inform Americans as to what is going on in the area of South and Southern Africa and the strategic importance therein, and that is the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society is holding meetings throughout the United States, is distributing films, distributing literature on this subject, and we would strongly suggest that you find out more about the work and efforts of the John Birch Society, not simply on the issue of South Africa, but on the whole realm of issues that threaten the security of the United States and the entire free world. We would strongly recommend that you get copies of this videotape and that you distribute them and show them to friends, people of influence in your own community, and in fact to people in Washington. We strongly suggest that you write or call your congressman, your senator, and the White House and register your strong protest against the South sellout of one more strategic U.S. ally, that is South Africa. Strongly suggest in these communiques that we treat South Africa at least as well as we are treating the Soviet Union, various Soviet bloc countries, and Red China, whom we trade with, whom we send aid to, whom we give credits to, and so forth. I believe that a quote from Edmund Burke is worth closing on. He said, "All that is necessary for evil to triumph is that good men do nothing." Ladies and gentlemen, good men and women for far too long in the United States have been doing nothing. This is simply one issue in which most Americans are doing nothing in, and I challenge you to get involved in this battle. I will close with a quote from Patrick Henry, who said in 1776, "For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it may cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it." We have not had time to give you the whole truth today, but we have tried to give you at least some of the high points of the battle for Southern Africa, which within a very few years will become the battle for the survival of the United States and the entire West. Thank you very much, and God bless you.